I went camping in late September because the season was ending and I wanted one last trip before winter. The campground was part of a large national forest, far from towns, with only a few marked sites and miles of unmanaged land around them. I chose a walk-in site that required a long hike from the parking lot. I wanted distance from other people. I wanted silence. I told myself I was experienced enough to handle being alone for a few nights. The hike-in took most of the afternoon. The trail was narrow and barely maintained. Fallen leaves covered the ground, hiding rocks and roots that caught my boots and slowed me down. The forest felt older than the places I usually camped. The trees were taller and closer together, blocking sunlight even in the middle of the day. I noticed how quiet it was. There were birds, but fewer than expected. No distant road noise. No planes. Just wind moving slowly through branches. When I reached the campsite, it felt more like a clearing someone had once used than an official spot. There was an old fire ring filled with ash and leaves, and a flat area where the ground had been pressed down over time. I set my pack down and took a moment to look around. Thick forest in every direction. No sight lines beyond a few yards. The feeling was not fear yet, but awareness. I was completely on my own. I set up my tent carefully, checking the ground for sharp rocks. I hung my food bag far from where I planned to sleep. I collected firewood while there was still daylight, walking short distances from the site and keeping track of my direction. I remember thinking how easy it would be to get turned around if I wasn't paying attention. Everything looked the same once you stepped into the trees. As evening came, the temperature dropped fast. The forest darkened earlier than expected. Shadows filled in the spaces between trees, turning the woods into a solid wall. I made a small fire and cooked a simple meal. The smoke rose straight up, barely moving. That should have felt peaceful, but it didn't. The air felt heavy, like it was holding something in. After I ate, I sat by the fire longer than planned. I kept listening. Every sound felt closer than it should have. A branch snapping in the distance. Leaves shifting. Something moving slowly far away. I told myself it was animals, but the sounds never rushed. They started, stopped, then started again. Controlled. I went into my tent when the fire burned down. Inside, the darkness felt tighter. The fabric walls were thin, and every sound passed through clearly. I lay there staring up, trying to relax my breathing. The forest never went fully quiet. There was always something moving. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps. Not fast, not heavy, slow steps through dry leaves. One at a time. I froze. My body went tense instantly. The steps came closer, then stopped. I could feel someone standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. I waited, barely breathing. The steps started again, circling the campsite. They stayed just outside the reach of my tent. I could hear leaves pressing down, then lifting. The pattern was too steady to be an animal. It took time. Whoever was walked slowly, like they were studying the space. Then everything stopped. I lay awake for hours after that. Nothing else happened, but my mind never settled. When morning came, I crawled out of the tent and scanned the ground. The leaves were disturbed around the site. Footprints were hard to see, but I could make out deep impressions where someone had stood for a while. Boot marks. Large. Fresh. I considered leaving right then, but part of me didn't want to believe what it suggested. I told myself someone might have passed through, maybe another camper who got lost. I packed my gear tighter, kept everything close, and decided to stay one more night. I didn't want fear to control me. The day felt long. I stayed near camp, exploring only a little. I noticed signs that made my stomach tighten. A snapped branch at shoulder height. A piece of food wrapper half buried under leaves, not mine. A place where the ground was pressed down like someone had been sitting there recently, facing my campsite. That evening, the forest felt different. The air was colder. The wind moved more often, but it didn't explain everything I heard. As darkness came, I skipped making a fire. I didn't want light drawing attention. I ate cold food and went into my tent early. The footsteps returned after dark, closer than before. They stopped right outside the tent. I could hear breathing. Slow, controlled, not tired, not rushed. Whoever was stood there for a long time. I felt exposed in a way I never had before. There was nothing between us but thin fabric and darkness. Then the steps moved away. I stayed awake until morning, shaking from tension and lack of sleep. At first light, I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't care about being neat. I wanted distance. As I left the clearing, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. Fresh cuts on tree bark along the trail, like markers. Not random damage. Intentional. Halfway back to the parking lot, I found a hidden camp off the trail. A tarp stretched low between trees. Old cans, empty packages, a sleeping area worn into the dirt. The spot had a clear view of the path leading to my campsite. I didn't stop. I kept moving until I reached my car. When I got home, I contacted park authorities and reported everything. Weeks later, I learned they found a man living illegally in that area. He had been watching solo campers for years, waiting, studying routines, choosing when to move closer. I still camp, but never alone and never without thinking about how thin the line is between peace and danger. That forest taught me that the most frightening thing out there is not something imagined. It is the quiet patience of someone real, hidden, and close enough to watch you breathe in the dark. I went camping alone because I needed to get away from everything that had been stacking up in my life. Work had been long days with no breaks, my sleep schedule was broken, and my head felt loud all the time. I chose a state forest a few hours from home, a place with long trails, primitive campsites, and no cell service once you went deep enough. I wanted quiet. I wanted to feel small for a while. I packed simple gear, small tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, a headlamp, extra batteries, a pocket knife, a first aid kit, and enough food for 3 days. I told one friend where I would be, printed a paper map, and left early in the morning. The drive took me through back roads that slowly lost traffic and noise. Gas stations became rare. Houses thinned out. The forest swallowed the road, tall trees closing in on both sides. When I reached the trailhead parking lot, there were only 2 other cars. Both looked old and dusty, like they had been there overnight. I parked, locked my car, and stood for a moment listening. Wind moved through the leaves. Birds called from somewhere high above. Nothing else. No engines. No voices. It felt calm in a way that pressed down on my ears. The hike to the campsite took about 3 hours. The trail was narrow and uneven, with roots pushing through the dirt and rocks that rolled underfoot. I stopped often to drink water and check the map. The deeper I went, the more isolated it felt. The forest grew thicker. Sunlight broke through in scattered patches. I noticed signs of other campers, old fire rings, broken branches, flattened grass, but nothing recent. No fresh footprints. No trash. That made me feel better at first. By mid-afternoon, I reached the campsite I had marked beforehand. It sat near a slow-moving creek with enough flat ground for a tent and a clear area for a fire. I dropped my pack and took time setting up carefully. I checked the ground for rocks. I secured the stakes deep. I arranged my gear neatly inside the tent. I hung my food bag from a tree branch far from where I planned to sleep. Everything felt routine, familiar, safe. As evening came, the forest changed. Sound softened. The air cooled fast. Shadows stretched and blended together. I cooked a simple meal and ate slowly, watching the light fade. I felt tired in a good way, the kind of tired that comes from using your body all day. When darkness settled in fully, it felt thick. My headlamp only reached so far before the trees swallowed the light. I sat by the dying fire longer than I needed to, not because I was scared, but because the dark felt heavier than expected. I crawled in my tent and zipped it shut. The sleeping bag felt cold at first, then warmed around me. The creek made a steady sound nearby, soft and constant. I lay there listening, letting my breathing slow. At some point, I drifted into shallow sleep. I woke up to the sound of something moving through leaves. It was slow and uneven, not like a deer running, not like wind. I stayed still, listening. The sound stopped. Silence followed. I told myself it was an animal passing through, maybe curious about the campsite. My heart slowed again. I closed my eyes. The sound came back, closer this time. Leaves pressed down, then released. A footstep pattern, spaced too evenly. I opened my eyes and stared at the thin wall of the tent. My headlamp was beside me, but I did not turn it on. I did not move. I listened. The creek kept flowing. The forest stayed quiet. Whatever was out there stood still for a long time. Eventually, the sound faded away. I lay awake for hours after that, never fully sleeping. When morning came, I felt drained and stiff. Sunlight filtered through the tent fabric, dull and pale. I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped out. The campsite looked normal at first. Fire pit untouched. Food bag still hanging. Then I noticed the ground near the edge of the trees. There were footprints, clear impressions in the soft dirt leading toward my tent, stopping just a few feet away, then circling around before heading back into the forest. They were boot prints, large, deep, fresh. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. My chest felt tight. I tried to think logically. Another camper might have passed through during the night, curious, unaware someone was sleeping there. But the idea did not sit right. The prints were careful, slow, purposeful. I packed up some of my gear, intending to leave early, but part of me resisted. I told myself I was overreacting, that fear was filling in gaps with worse thoughts. I decided to stay one more night, but remain alert. I moved my campsite slightly closer to the creek where the ground was softer and visibility was better. I cleared branches, widened my view, and made sure my headlamp and knife were within reach at all times. The day passed quietly. I explored nearby trails, but never went far. I noticed more signs of someone else. A broken branch that looked snapped recently. A crushed patch of grass that had not been there before. Nothing definitive, just enough to keep my nerves tight. That night, I did not sleep much. Every small sound pulled me back to full awareness. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, measured, closer than before. I held my breath. The steps stopped just outside the edge of the clearing. I could sense someone standing there, watching, waiting. Time stretched. My muscles cramped from staying still. Then the footsteps circled the campsite. They moved behind my tent. I felt the pressure of presence just beyond the thin fabric. I could hear breathing, faint but steady. Not rushed, not scared, calm. I knew then that this was not chance. This was someone who had followed me. Someone who knew I was alone. After what felt like forever, the steps retreated again. I did not sleep after that. When dawn came, I packed everything as fast and quietly as I could. I did not eat. I did not stop. I left gear behind that slowed me down. I kept my eyes scanning the trees, my ears tuned for movement. Halfway back to the trailhead, I found something that made my stomach drop. A small camp hidden off the trail. A tarp stretched between trees. Empty food wrappers. A cold fire pit. Boot prints matching the ones near my tent. The camp was positioned with a clear view of the trail leading to my campsite. I did not linger. I kept moving until my legs burned and my lungs ached. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was untouched. The other vehicles were gone. I drove straight to the nearest town and contacted authorities. I showed them the photos I had taken of the footprints and the hidden camp. Rangers searched the area later that week. A month after the trip, I received a call. They had found the person. A man living illegally in the forest with a history of stalking campers and breaking into unattended sites. He had been watching people for years, choosing those who were alone. I do not camp alone anymore. I still think about that forest, about how quiet it was, how easy it was for someone to disappear into it. The fear did not come from darkness or animals. It came from knowing that another human being had stood just feet away from me in the night, silent, patient, and fully real. I decided to go camping alone in early May before summer crowds showed up. The weather forecast looked stable, the nights cool, but not freezing, and the forest I chose was one I had visited once years earlier with friends. It was a large public forest with long gravel access roads and scattered primitive campsites that were first come, first served. No reservations. No camp hosts. I wanted distance and quiet. I wanted to feel like the world had slowed down. The drive-in took longer than expected. The paved road turned into gravel, then into something barely maintained. Potholes forced me to slow down. Tall trees pressed in on both sides, and my phone lost signal completely. By the time I reached the campground area, the sun was already dropping lower in the sky. I passed several empty sites, before choosing one near the end of the road. It was far from the entrance, surrounded by trees, and backed up against a long stretch of forest with no trails behind it. I parked and stepped out of the car. The silence felt thick. No wind, no distant traffic, just insects and the occasional bird. I stood there for a moment longer than needed, taking it in. I unloaded my gear and set up my tent on a patch of dirt that looked flat enough. The ground was hard and dry. Pine needles covered everything. I noticed an old fire ring and bits of melted plastic half buried in the dirt. Signs that someone had camped there before, but not recently. I worked slowly, making sure everything was right. I placed my cooler inside the car instead of outside. I double-checked the tent stakes. I laid my flashlight, headlamp, and extra batteries within reach. I remember thinking it was strange how alone the place felt. It was a weekend, but I had not seen another car since turning onto the gravel road. As the light faded, the forest changed. Shadows grew longer. Shapes blended together. I cooked a simple meal on a small stove and ate sitting on a folding chair. Every sound stood out. A twig snapping somewhere to my left. Leaves shifting behind me. Each time, I turned and looked, scanning between trees. I told myself it was normal forest noise, but my body stayed tense. I went into my tent earlier than usual. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun disappeared. Inside the tent, the air felt still and close. I lay on my sleeping pad listening. An owl called once, then went silent. After that, the forest felt empty in a way that made my ears ring. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up. Something had pulled me out of sleep sharply, like a switch being flipped. I lay there, eyes open, listening. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and careful, gravel crunching lightly underweight. They were coming from the direction of the road. I stayed still. I didn't reach for my light. I didn't move. The steps stopped. The silence stretched. My heartbeat felt loud inside my chest. After a long moment, the steps started again, closer now. Whoever was moved off the road and into the campsite. The sound changed from gravel to dirt and pine needles. They walked around my car. I could hear the shift in sound as they moved closer, then farther. I pictured someone standing beside my door, peering in through the windows. The thought made my stomach tighten. The steps paused near the back of the car, then moved toward my tent. They stopped a few feet away. I could feel the presence, even without seeing it. Someone standing there, close enough to hear me breathe. The tent fabric did nothing to block sound. I listened for breathing, but heard none. Just stillness. After what felt like an hour, the steps moved away. Slowly, back toward the road. Then silence again. I did not sleep after that. When morning finally came, the light felt thin and gray. I unzipped the tent and stepped out carefully. The campsite looked normal at first. Then I saw the footprints. Clear impressions in the dirt and needles near my car. Boot prints. Large. Deep. Fresh. They circled the car and stopped near my tent. I felt a wave of cold move through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. I walked the perimeter of the campsite slowly, following the prints. They came from the road and went back the same way. No hesitation. No wandering. Purposeful. I packed up most of my gear, planning to leave. But a part of me hesitated. I told myself maybe it was another camper checking if the site was occupied. Maybe someone had car trouble and was looking for help. I wanted that explanation to be true. I decided to stay one more night, but remain alert. I moved my tent closer to the car. I locked my doors. I kept my keys and flashlight in my pocket all day. I spent the daylight hours walking short distances around the area, trying to understand the layout better. That was when I noticed something else. Across the road from my campsite, partially hidden behind trees, was a narrow path that didn't show on any map. It looked worn, like it had been used often. The ground was packed down, and branches had been cut back cleanly. I followed it a short distance before stopping. It led deeper into the forest, out of sight. I didn't like that it was there. That evening, the feeling returned. The air felt wrong, heavy and still. I skipped cooking and ate cold food. I did not use any lights once it got dark. I sat inside my tent listening. The footsteps came again, earlier this time. They came from the path. Slow, steady, no rush. They crossed the road and entered the campsite. I heard the gravel shift underweight. then dirt, then pine needles. The steps circled the car again. This time, they didn't stop there. They came straight toward the tent. They stopped right outside. I could hear breathing now. Calm, controlled, close. I could picture the shape of a person standing there, head tilted, listening. I felt completely exposed. There was nothing I could do without making noise. Nothing I could do without being seen. After a long time, the breathing moved away. The steps retreated back toward the path, then disappeared. I stayed awake until sunrise. As soon as it was light enough to see, I packed everything I could fit into the car. I didn't take time to organize. I didn't eat. I started driving out immediately. About a mile down the gravel road, I saw something that made me slam on the brakes. Off to the side of the road, hidden among trees, was a small camp. A tarp stretched low, old cans, food wrappers, a folding chair, a fire ring with fresh ash. The camp faced the road leading to my site. I drove straight to the nearest town and contacted authorities. I showed them photos I had taken of the footprints and the hidden camp. Weeks later, I was informed that they found a man living illegally in the forest. He had been watching campsites, approaching people at night, testing who was alone and who would leave. I never went back to that forest. I still camp, but only in busy areas and never alone. What stays with me is not just the fear, but the quiet patience of someone real, choosing the right moment, standing just outside my shelter in the dark, close enough to listen, close enough to wait. I went camping alone because I needed distance from people, not comfort. I picked a remote forest road that ended near an old trail system that no longer showed up on most maps. The place was public land, but rarely used. The kind of area where the road narrows, the trees lean in, and the silence feels earned. I planned 3 nights. No schedule, no rush, just space. The drive took hours longer than expected. The paved road turned into gravel, then into something barely passable. Deep ruts forced me to crawl forward. Branches scraped along the sides of my car. My phone lost signal completely, not even emergency bars. When I finally reached the end of the road, there was a wide dirt turnaround and nothing else. No sign, no gate, just forest in every direction. I parked near the tree line and sat in the car for a minute with the engine off. The quiet pressed in hard. No wind, no distant traffic, just insects and a faint creak from trees shifting under their own weight. I grabbed my pack and followed a barely visible trail leading downhill. It wasn't marked, but the ground was worn enough to tell people had used it before. After about 20 minutes of walking, I reached a flat clearing near a dry creek bed. The creek looked like it hadn't run in months. Smooth stones were packed into the dirt, and fallen leaves filled the shallow channel. The clearing felt hidden, surrounded by thick trees on all sides. No sight lines beyond 30 feet. I didn't love that, but I told myself it meant privacy. I set up my tent slowly, checking the ground, moving rocks, making sure nothing sharp was underneath. I laid my gear out neatly. Food bag hung far from the tent. Flashlight, headlamp, and knife placed within reach. The air smelled old, like damp leaves and soil that never fully dried. As evening came, the forest darkened faster than I expected. The tree cover blocked most of the sky. I cooked a simple meal and ate while standing, scanning the trees without really meaning to. I noticed something then that bothered me. On the far side of the clearing, partially hidden behind brush, was an old fire ring. Not ancient, not collapsed. Someone had used it recently enough that the stones were still dark with soot. That meant someone else knew about this place. I told myself it didn't matter. Public land meant shared space. I went into my tent shortly after dark. The temperature dropped fast, and the still air made every sound carry. I lay on my back, listening to the forest. Small movements, insects, leaves shifting for no clear reason. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night with my heart racing. I didn't know why at first. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. Not close, but not far either. Someone moving through leaves, taking care not to rush. I stayed completely still. I didn't reach for my light. I focused on breathing quietly. The steps stopped. Silence followed, thick and heavy. I waited, muscles tight, expecting the sound to return. It did. The steps moved closer, circling the clearing. I could track the movement by sound alone. Whoever was stayed just outside the lightless edge of the trees. They didn't step into the open space. They walked slowly, like they were studying the area. Then they stopped. I could feel the presence even without seeing it. Someone standing still, close enough to hear me move if I did. Time stretched. My legs went numb from staying tense. Eventually, the steps moved away, fading back into the forest. I didn't sleep again. When morning came, the light felt weak and gray. I unzipped the tent carefully and stepped out. The clearing looked normal, but the ground told a different story. Leaves had been disturbed around the edge. In several spots, I could see partial boot prints pressed into the dirt. Large, heavy, not mine. They formed a loose circle. I packed up most of my gear right then. My plan changed from relaxing to leaving. Still, part of me hesitated. I didn't want to believe what it suggested. I told myself someone might have passed through, maybe checking the area, unaware I was there. I decided to stay one more day, but remain alert. I didn't want to hike out tired and shaken. I spent the daylight hours exploring nearby, staying close to camp. That was when I noticed more signs. A narrow trail leading away from the clearing that wasn't there before, or at least I hadn't noticed it. Branches bent back deliberately. Ground packed down. Not an animal trail. A human one. It led uphill toward the road. I followed it for a short distance before stopping. I didn't like how direct it felt. That evening, the forest felt wrong. The air was still again. No wind. No birds. Even insects seemed quieter. I skipped making a fire. I ate cold food and went into my tent before full dark. The footsteps returned earlier this time. They came from uphill, from the direction of the trail. Slow, careful, each step placed with intention. They stopped at the edge of the clearing. I could hear breathing now. Calm, controlled, not rushed. Someone stood there for a long time, close enough that any sound I made would carry. I felt exposed in a way I never had before. The tent felt useless. Thin fabric separating me from someone who had chosen this moment. I stayed frozen, staring at the wall inches from my face. Eventually, the steps moved again. This time they came closer, entering the clearing. Leaves shifted softly. The person moved around my tent. I could sense them circling, stopping occasionally, then moving again. They paused right behind me. I could hear the sound of fabric brushing lightly against something solid. The tent wall pressed inward slightly, then released. Not a grab, not an accident, a test. Then they stepped away. The footsteps retreated slowly, back toward the trail, and disappeared. I did not wait for morning. I packed in the dark, hands shaking, gear stuffed wherever it fit. I didn't care about noise anymore. I wanted distance. I climbed uphill toward the road with only my headlamp guiding me. Every shadow felt like movement. Every sound made my heart jump. When I reached the road, I saw something that made everything clear. About 50 yards from where I had parked was a second vehicle, hidden behind brush. Old, dull paint, windows fogged from the inside. The tires were positioned for a quick exit. Next to it was a small camp. Not random, organized. A tarp shelter, food supplies, a clear view of the trail leading down to my campsite. I got in my car and left immediately. I didn't stop until I reached a town with lights and people. I reported everything to authorities the next day. Weeks later, I learned they found a man living out there, moving camps often, watching remote sites, approaching people at night to see who would leave and who would stay. He had been doing it for years. I still camp, but never alone, and never where someone could watch me without being seen. What stayed with me wasn't just fear. It was the realization that someone had stood inches away from me in the dark, patient, quiet, and completely real, waiting to see what I would do. I went camping alone because I needed distance from people, not comfort. I picked a remote forest road that ended near an old trail system that no longer showed up on most maps. The place was public land, but rarely used. The kind of area where the road narrows, the trees lean in, and the silence feels earned. I planned 3 nights. No schedule, no rush, just space. The drive-in took hours longer than expected. The paved road turned into gravel. then into something barely passable. Deep ruts forced me to crawl forward. Branches scraped along the sides of my car. My phone lost signal completely. Not even emergency bars. When I finally reached the end of the road, there was a wide dirt turnaround and nothing else. No sign, no gate, just forest in every direction. I parked near the tree line and sat in the car for a minute with the engine off. The quiet pressed in hard. No wind, no distant traffic, just insects and a faint creak from trees shifting under their own weight. I grabbed my pack and followed a barely visible trail leading downhill. It wasn't marked, but the ground was worn enough to tell people had used it before. After about 20 minutes of walking, I reached a flat clearing near a dry creek bed. The creek looked like it hadn't run in months. Smooth stones were packed into the dirt, and fallen leaves filled the shallow channel. The clearing felt hidden, surrounded by thick trees on all sides. No sight lines beyond 30 feet. I didn't love that, but I told myself it meant privacy. I set up my tent slowly, checking the ground, moving rocks, making sure nothing sharp was underneath. I lay my gear out neatly. Food bag hung far from the tent. Flashlight, headlamp, and knife placed within reach. The air smelled old, like damp leaves and soil that never fully dried. As evening came, the forest darkened faster than I expected. The tree cover blocked most of the sky. I cooked a simple meal and ate while standing, scanning the trees without really meaning to. I noticed something then that bothered me. On the far side of the clearing, partially hidden behind brush, was an old fire ring. Not ancient, not collapsed. Someone had used it recently enough that the stones were still dark with soot. That meant someone else knew about this place. I told myself it didn't matter. Public land meant shared space. I went into my tent shortly after dark. The temperature dropped fast, and the still air made every sound carry. I lay on my back, listening to the forest. Small movements, insects, leaves shifting for no clear reason. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night with my heart racing. I didn't know why at first. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. Not close, but not far either. Someone moving through leaves, taking care not to rush. I stayed completely still. I didn't reach for my light. I focused on breathing quietly. The steps stopped. Silence followed, thick and heavy. I waited, muscles tight, expecting the sound to return. It did. The steps moved closer, circling the clearing. I could track the movement by sound alone. Whoever was stayed just outside the lightless edge of the trees. They didn't step into the open space. They walked slowly, like they were studying the area. Then they stopped. I could feel the presence even without seeing it. Someone standing still, close enough to hear me move if I did. Time stretched. My legs went numb from staying tense. Eventually, the steps moved away, fading back into the forest. I didn't sleep again. When morning came, the light felt weak and gray. I unzipped the tent carefully and stepped out. The clearing looked normal, but the ground told a different story. Leaves had been disturbed around the edge. In several spots, I could see partial boot prints pressed into the dirt. Large, heavy, not mine. They formed a loose circle. I packed up most of my gear right then. My plan changed from relaxing to leaving. Still, part of me hesitated. I didn't want to believe what it suggested. I told myself someone might have passed through, maybe checking the area, unaware I was there. I decided to stay one more day, but remain alert. I didn't want to hike out tired and shaken. I spent the daylight hours exploring nearby, staying close to camp. That was when I noticed more signs. A narrow trail leading away from the clearing that wasn't there before, or at least I hadn't noticed it. Branches bent back deliberately. Ground packed down, not an animal trail. A human one. It led uphill toward the road. I followed it for a short distance before stopping. I didn't like how direct it felt. That evening, the forest felt wrong. The air was still again. No wind, no birds. Even insects seemed quieter. I skipped making a fire. I ate cold food and went in my tent before full dark. The footsteps returned earlier this time. They came from uphill, from the direction of the trail. Slow, careful, each step placed with intention. They stopped at the edge of the clearing. I could hear breathing now. Calm, controlled, not rushed. Someone stood there for a long time, close enough that any sound I made would carry. I felt exposed in a way I never had before. The tent felt useless, thin fabric separating me from someone who had chosen this moment. I stayed frozen, staring at the wall inches from my face. Eventually, the steps moved again. This time they came closer, entering the clearing. Leaves shifted softly. The person moved around my tent. I could sense them circling, stopping occasionally, then moving again. They paused right behind me. I could hear the sound of fabric brushing lightly against something solid. The tent wall pressed inward slightly, then released. Not a grab, not an accident, a test. Then they stepped away. The footsteps retreated slowly, back toward the trail, and disappeared. I did not wait for morning. I packed in the dark, hands shaking, gear stuffed wherever it fit. I didn't care about noise anymore. I wanted distance. I climbed uphill toward the road with only my headlamp guiding me. Every shadow felt like movement. Every sound made my heart jump. When I reached the road, I saw something that made everything clear. About 50 yards from where I had parked was a second vehicle, hidden behind brush. Old, dull paint, windows fogged from the inside. The tires were positioned for a quick exit. Next to it was a small camp. Not random, organized. A tarp shelter, food supplies, a clear view of the trail leading down to my campsite. I got in my car and left immediately. I didn't stop until I reached a town with lights and people. I reported everything to authorities the next day. Weeks later, I learned they found a man living out there, moving camps often, watching remote sites, approaching people at night to see who would leave and who would stay. He'd been doing it for years. I still camp, but never alone, and never where someone could watch me without being seen. What stayed with me wasn't just fear. It was the realization that someone had stood inches away from me in the dark, patient, quiet, and completely real, waiting to see what I would do. I went camping alone in mid-October because the season was ending and I thought that meant fewer people. The Forest Service campground I chose was still officially open, but I knew from experience that most campers had already packed it in for the year. I wanted cold air, empty trails, and long nights where nothing pulled at my attention. I packed for 4 days, checked the weather twice, filled my gas tank, and drove out before sunrise. The campground sat at the end of a long Forest Service road that climbed steadily into higher ground. The drive took longer than expected. The road narrowed, the trees grew denser, and the sunlight faded as clouds thickened overhead. By the time I reached the campground entrance, my phone had no signal at all. The sign was weathered, paint peeling, and the smaller notice board underneath was empty. No warnings, no updates, just silence and trees. There were 12 campsites total. Only one other vehicle sat in the lot, parked crooked and covered in dust. No movement around it. I chose a site far from the entrance, near the edge of the woods, with a short path leading toward an overlook that faced a long stretch of forested valley. The ground was hard and cold. Fallen leaves covered everything. The air smelled like damp wood and old soil. I set up my tent carefully, taking more time than usual. I cleared leaves, checked the ground, and made sure the tent was tight and stable. I placed my gear inside neatly, food sealed and locked in a hard container inside my car instead of hanging it. I noticed then that the fire ring at my site was filled with fresh ash, not rain flattened, not scattered. Someone had used it recently. That should have bothered me more than it did. The afternoon passed quietly. I walked the nearby trail, staying within sight of the campground. The woods were thick and quiet, the kind of quiet that made small sounds feel loud. No birds, no distant engines, just the sound of my boots on dirt and leaves. When I returned to camp, the other vehicle was still there. No sign of its owner. As evening came, the temperature dropped fast. Clouds rolled lower, pressing the sky down. I cooked a simple meal and ate quickly, standing, my eyes drifting toward the trees without meaning to. I felt watched in a vague way, not sharp fear, just a sense that the space around me was not as empty as it looked. I went into my tent before full dark. The wind picked up slightly, pushing branches against each other. Inside the tent, every sound carried. Leaves scraping, a branch snapping somewhere far off. I lay on my back staring up, listening. Sometime after midnight, I woke up suddenly. not from a noise, but from a feeling of being alert without reason. My body felt tense before my mind caught up. I stayed still and listened. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, careful, not rushed. They came from the direction of the other campsite. The sound of boots on gravel, then dirt. They stopped for a long time. Then they started again, closer now. I held my breath. The steps move around my campsite, staying just outside the clearing. I could track them by sound alone. Whoever was moved deliberately, avoiding loose rocks, placing each step with care. That scared me more than fast movement would have. The steps stopped near the back of my tent. I could feel the presence there, close enough that the thin fabric felt meaningless. I waited for breathing, for a cough, for anything human. Nothing came, just stillness. After a long stretch of time, the steps moved away, slowly, back toward the trees. I did not sleep again that night. Morning came gray and cold. A light fog hung low between the trees. I stepped out of my tent and immediately checked the ground. Footprints cut through the leaves around my site. Boot prints, large, heavy, fresh. They circled the tent, paused in several places, then led back toward the other campsite. I felt a tightness in my chest that did not go away. I walked over to the other campsite cautiously. The vehicle was still there, an old SUV with faded paint and mud caked into the wheel wells. The windows were fogged from the inside. The campsite itself was messy. Gear scattered, a sleeping bag laid out on the ground, food wrappers half buried under leaves. It looked lived in, not like someone passing through. No one was there. I went back to my site and packed most of my gear. I planned to leave that day. Still, part of me hesitated. I told myself it was daylight. I told myself I was being paranoid. I decided to wait until afternoon, then leave. That was a mistake. Around midday, I noticed something new. Tire tracks on a side road branching off behind the campground. Fresh, deep. They had not been there when I arrived. The side road led uphill into thick forest out of sight. As the hours passed, the forest felt tighter. Sounds felt closer. I stayed near my site, my keys in my pocket, my head on a swivel. When evening came again, the fog returned, thicker than before. The temperature dropped hard. I skipped cooking. I didn't want light. I ate cold food and went into my tent before dark. The footsteps came earlier this time. They came from the uphill road. Slow, steady, direct. I could hear gravel crunch underweight. Then dirt, then leaves. The steps entered my campsite without hesitation. They moved straight toward the tent. I could hear breathing now. Calm, controlled, close. Someone stood inches away from me, separated by fabric and nothing else. The tent wall pressed inward slightly, then released. Not enough to tear, just enough to let me know they were there. I stayed frozen. My muscles burned from tension. Time stretched in a way that felt unreal. Eventually, the steps moved away. This time they did not retreat fully. They stopped near the edge of the clearing and stayed there for a long time, like they were waiting. When the footsteps finally faded, I did not wait for morning. I packed everything as fast as I could, not caring about noise. I left gear behind that slowed me down. I walked backward to my car, scanning the trees, my headlamp shaking with my hands. When I reached the road, I saw something that erased all doubt. The side road uphill now had a second vehicle parked behind brush. Engines still warm, positioned to watch the campground entrance. I got in my car and drove out without stopping. Branches scraped the sides. Rocks kicked up. I didn't slow down until I hit pavement and saw lights. Days later, I reported everything. Weeks after that, I learned authorities had found a man living between campsites, moving vehicles, watching campers at night, waiting to see who would stay. He had been doing it for years. I still camp, but never alone, and never where someone can disappear into the trees without being seen. What stays with me isn't just fear. It's the memory of how quiet it was when someone stood just outside my tent, patient, close, and completely real, waiting in the dark. I went camping alone in early spring because the desert was still cool and the crowds hadn't arrived yet. I chose a remote canyon area managed by the state, a place known for long dry washes, scattered mesquite trees, and old campsites that barely saw use anymore. It wasn't a campground with signs or numbered spots. It was open land where you parked, walked in, and made your own space. I had camped in deserts before and respected them. I checked weather reports, studied maps, and planned to stay 2 nights. The drive took most of the day. Pavement faded into gravel, then into a narrow dirt road with deep ruts. The land flattened out, then dropped suddenly into low canyon country. Everything looked open, but it wasn't. Small rises and cuts in the land blocked sight lines. You could be close to someone without ever seeing them. My phone lost signal about an hour before I arrived. I didn't expect to need it. I parked near a bend in the dirt road, where tire tracks showed others had stopped before. From there, I walked about half a mile into the canyon, following a dry wash that curved between tall dirt walls. The wash was wide, sandy, and littered with driftwood from past floods. I knew not to camp directly in it, so I chose a flat shelf about 10 feet higher, tucked against one of the canyon walls. I set up my tent with care. The ground was hard-packed, dirt mixed with small stones. I secured everything tightly. The desert wind could pick up fast without warning. I laid my gear out neatly and stored my food in sealed containers. The place felt quiet but not peaceful. Sound traveled strangely. A bird call echoed longer than it should have. A gust of wind sounded closer than it was. As the sun dropped, the canyon changed color. Reds and browns deepened. Shadows filled the wash below. I cooked a simple meal and ate slowly, watching the light fade. When the sun finally disappeared, the temperature dropped hard. The sky filled with stars, sharp and bright. There were no other lights anywhere. I went in my tent early. Desert nights always made me tired. The ground radiated cold, and the air felt dry and thin. I lay there listening. Wind moved through the canyon in uneven bursts. Sand shifted. Somewhere far off, something small moved over rock. Everything felt normal. I woke up sometime after midnight with the feeling that I wasn't alone. I didn't hear anything at first. I lay still, waiting. Then I heard footsteps on sand. Slow, careful, measured. They came from the wash below. Each step slid slightly, then settled. Someone was walking uphill. I felt my chest tighten. There was no reason for anyone to be there at that hour. This area was remote, and the road was far enough away that casual visitors didn't wander in at night. I stayed completely still. I didn't reach for my headlamp. The footsteps stopped partway up the slope. Silence stretched out, thick and uncomfortable. Then the steps started again, closer this time. Sand shifted softly as someone climbed. The steps stopped just below my campsite. I could sense someone standing there, looking up at my tent. The fabric walls felt useless. I listened hard for breathing. At first, I heard nothing. Then I heard a faint sound. Slow breathing. Calm. Controlled. Whoever was stayed there for a long time. Eventually, the steps moved again, circling the base of the shelf. I could track the movement by sound alone. They didn't rush. They didn't stumble. They moved like someone who knew the terrain well. After a while, the footsteps faded back down into the wash and disappeared. I didn't sleep again. When morning came, the desert looked harmless again. Sunlight filled the canyon, warming the rock walls. I climbed down and checked the wash. Fresh footprints marked the sand clearly. Boot prints, large, deep. They came from downstream, climbed partway up toward my camp, circled, then went back the same way. I felt uneasy, but told myself it could have been another camper passing through. Maybe someone who realized the area was occupied and left. I didn't want fear to decide everything. I planned to stay the second night, but stay alert. The day passed slowly. I explored the canyon, staying close. That was when I noticed something that made my stomach sink. About a quarter-mile downstream, tucked behind a bend, was another campsite. Not old, not abandoned, recent. A small tarp shelter, empty water jugs, food wrappers buried under rocks. The site had a clear view up the wash toward my camp. Someone had been watching the canyon. As afternoon wore on, clouds began to build far off on the horizon. Tall, dark shapes rising slowly. I checked the weather again on my map notes. No storms expected nearby, but desert weather could change fast. I considered leaving early, but daylight and clear ground made me feel safer than hiking out at night. As evening came, the air grew heavy. Wind picked up, then died suddenly. The canyon felt closed in. I skipped cooking and ate dry food. I kept my headlamp off after dark. The footsteps came again, earlier this time. They came from upstream now, not downstream. That told me whoever had moved around the canyon during the day. The steps were closer, more direct. They climbed the slope without hesitation and stopped just outside my tent. I heard breathing again, closer than before. The tent wall shifted slightly inward, brushing against my sleeping bag. Not enough to damage it, enough to let me know someone was right there. Then something else happened. Far off, thunder rolled. Low, distant, but real. Rain began minutes later. Not light rain. Heavy drops hitting rock and dirt hard. The sound echoed through the canyon. I knew immediately what that meant. Flash flooding didn't need rain overhead. Rain miles away could send water racing through dry washes without warning. I listened as the rain intensified. Then I heard movement again outside the tent. Faster this time. Someone moved away quickly, heading down toward the wash. Within minutes, I heard it. A low roar. Water rushing through the canyon, picking up speed. The dry wash was filling fast. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed what I could carry and climbed higher, scrambling up the rocky slope behind my campsite. Rain soaked everything. My hand slipped. Below me, water surged through the wash, carrying branches and debris. From higher ground, I saw something in the wash that made everything clear. Downstream, near the hidden camp, a section of debris had been piled deliberately across part of the channel. It didn't block the water completely, but it redirected the flow toward my campsite. Someone had tried to force water toward where I was sleeping. The debris broke apart under the pressure, and the flood spread naturally again, but the intent was obvious. This wasn't an accident. I stayed on high ground until the rain passed and the water receded enough to move safely. When it did, I climbed out of the canyon and hiked straight back to my car, shaking from cold and adrenaline. At the road, I found another vehicle parked farther down, hidden behind brush. Fresh tire tracks, mud still wet. I drove out immediately and reported everything as soon as I reached signal. Authorities investigated later and found a man living along the canyon system, sabotaging campsites and stealing gear after people fled. He had caused near misses before, using the terrain and weather to scare people off. I don't camp in dry washes anymore. I don't camp anywhere that gives someone the high ground without visibility. The desert didn't scare me that night. Another person did. Someone who knew the land well enough to use it, patient enough to wait, and real enough to leave footprints in sand and intent in the shape of moving water. I went camping alone at the start of summer because I wanted to reset my head. Life had felt heavy for months, and I needed space that didn't have walls, screens, or noise. I chose a large wildlife management area that allowed dispersed camping. No marked sites, no reservation system, no camp hosts, just dirt roads, old trails, and open forest. The kind of place where you are responsible for everything that happens to you. The drive-in took most of the day. Highways turned into back roads, then gravel, then a narrow dirt track that barely looked like a road anymore. Grass grew in the middle. Branches scraped the sides of my car. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. My phone lost signal hours before I arrived. The last sign of people I saw was a rusted mailbox at the edge of the forest, leaning sideways and filled with rainwater. When I finally stopped, it wasn't because I reached a destination. It was because the road ended at a wide clearing with tire marks and nothing else. No signs, no buildings, just trees in every direction. I parked near the edge and sat in the car for a minute with the engine off. The silence felt heavy, like pressure on my ears. No wind, no distant traffic, only insects and the soft creak of trees shifting in their roots. I grabbed my pack and walked down a faint trail that led away from the clearing. The ground was packed down just enough to show other people had used it before, but not recently. After about 10 minutes, the trail opened into a small flat area near a shallow pond. The water was dark and still, covered in leaves and bugs. Trees surrounded it tightly, blocking any long view in any direction. I chose a spot on slightly higher ground, away from the water. I set up my tent slowly and carefully. I checked the ground for rocks. I secured the stakes deep. I laid my sleeping bag and gear neatly inside. I hung my food bag from a branch far from where I would sleep. I placed my flashlight, headlamp, extra batteries, and knife within arm's reach. Everything felt routine, familiar, safe. As the afternoon passed, I explored the area around the pond. I noticed old signs of people, an abandoned fire ring filled with wet ash, a broken chair frame half buried in the dirt, pieces of rope tied around a tree trunk rotting from age. This place had been used before, but not often. It felt forgotten. By evening, the air cooled fast. The forest darkened early because the trees were so thick. I cooked a simple meal and ate while sitting on a fallen log. The pond reflected the darkening sky, smooth and black. No ripples, no movement. Insects buzzed near the surface, but nothing larger moved. The stillness felt unnatural, like the place was holding its breath. I went into my tent shortly after dark. The temperature dropped more, and the air inside felt cold and damp. I zipped the tent shut and lay on my back, listening. The forest never went silent. There were always small sounds. Leaves shifting, insects moving, a distant branch snapping, but none of it felt close. Sometime during the night, I woke up suddenly. My heart was racing before I knew why. I lay still, listening. At first, I heard nothing unusual. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, careful, measured. They were not near the pond. They were coming from the trail. Leaves pressed down softly, then released. Each step placed with intention. Not rushing, not wandering. I stayed completely still. I did not move my head. I did not reach for my light. I focused on breathing quietly. The steps stopped. Silence followed, thick and heavy. Then the steps started again, closer. They moved around the clearing, staying just outside the reach of my tent. I could track the movement by sound alone. Whoever it was walked slowly, like they were studying the space. I could feel the presence, even without seeing it. Someone was there, watching, waiting. The steps stopped near the back of my tent. I could hear breathing now. Slow, calm, controlled, not tired, not scared. Someone stood inches away from me, separated by thin fabric and darkness. The tent wall moved slightly, brushing against my sleeping bag, then returned to place. Not enough to tear. Not an accident. A test. My entire body felt frozen. My muscles burned from tension. Time stretched in a way that felt unreal. After a long moment, the steps moved away, slowly, back toward the trees. Then silence again. I did not sleep after that. When morning came, the light felt thin and gray. Fog hung low around the pond. I unzipped the tent carefully and stepped out. The clearing looked normal at first. Then I looked at the ground. Footprints, boot prints, clear impressions in the damp soil and leaves around my tent. Large, heavy, fresh. They formed a loose circle around the campsite. Several stopped close to the tent wall. My stomach dropped. I packed some of my gear immediately. My plan shifted from relaxing to leaving. Still, part of me hesitated. I told myself it could have been another camper passing through. Someone curious. Someone unaware I was there. I wanted that explanation to be true. I decided to stay one more day, but remain alert. I moved my tent slightly to a more open spot. I kept my keys and flashlight in my pocket. I stayed close to camp, exploring only short distances. That was when I found the trail. Behind the trees on the far side of the pond was a narrow path I hadn't noticed before. Branches had been bent back. The ground was packed down. It wasn't an animal trail. It was too clean, too straight. It led uphill, away from the pond, toward the road. I followed it for a short distance and stopped when I saw something else. A hidden camp, a tarp shelter tied between trees, empty food cans, plastic containers, a sleeping area worn into the dirt. The spot had a clear view of the trail leading to my campsite. Someone had been watching this area. I went back to my camp and packed everything I could. I planned to leave immediately. I didn't want another night. As I followed the trail uphill toward the road, I saw more signs. Fresh boot prints, cut branches, marked trees with small pieces of string tied around them, trail markers. When I reached the clearing where I had parked, I saw something that made everything clear. Another vehicle, old, dirty, parked behind brush, windows fogged from the inside, positioned with a clear view of the trail I had used. Next to it was another small camp. Not messy, organized, supplies stored neatly, a clear line of sight toward the forest path. This was not random. I got in my car and left immediately. I did not stop. I did not look back. I drove until I reached a town with lights, people, and signal. I reported everything. Weeks later, I learned authorities found a man living illegally in that area. He had been moving between hidden camps, watching solo campers, approaching them at night to see who would leave and who would stay. He had a history of stalking and theft in remote places. I still camp, but never alone and never in places where someone can hide without being seen. What stays with me isn't just fear. It's the memory of how real it all was. The footprints, the breathing, the quiet patience of someone standing inches away from me in the dark, waiting, watching, and choosing the right moment. I went camping alone in early December because I wanted to test myself before winter fully set in. The forest I chose was part of a massive public land area that used to support logging decades ago. Most of the old roads were still there, cutting deep into the hills, but they were no longer maintained. Snow came early in that region, and once it did, very few people went in. That was the appeal. I wanted isolation, cold air, and the kind of quiet that only exists when most people stay home. I drove for hours on highways that slowly thinned into back roads. Gas stations became rare. Cell service faded and then disappeared entirely. Eventually, I turned onto a logging road that looked barely passable. Snow sat in uneven patches, packed down by previous tires but already refreezing. Tall trees lined both sides, their branches heavy with frost. I drove slowly, careful not to slide off the narrow track. I finally stopped at a wide turnout where several logging roads branched off in different directions. The area felt abandoned. No signs, no recent tracks except my own and one other set that looked a few days old. I parked facing outward in case I needed to leave fast. When I shut off the engine, the silence was immediate and heavy. No wind, no birds, just still air and cold. I hiked about half a mile off the road, following one of the old cut lines through the trees. The snow was shallow but crunchy, loud under my boots. I reached a small clearing near a frozen creek. The creek was covered in ice, except for a narrow strip of dark water moving slowly underneath. The clearing was surrounded by trees on all sides, thick enough to block any long view. It wasn't perfect, but daylight was already fading, and I didn't want to keep moving in the cold. I set up my tent quickly, but carefully. The ground was frozen solid. I used rocks and deadwood to anchor the stakes. My fingers went numb even through gloves. I laid everything out inside the tent with purpose. Sleeping bag, extra layers, headlamp, knife, food sealed tightly and hung from a tree farther away. The cold made everything feel sharper, louder, more fragile. As darkness settled, the temperature dropped fast. My breath fogged in the air. I cooked a small meal on my stove, keeping it short to save fuel and heat. The light from my headlamp bounced off the snow, creating long, strange shadows between the trees. Every time I turned my head, the shadows shifted. I told myself it was normal, but my body stayed tense. I went into the tent early to conserve warmth. Inside, the cold pressed in from every direction. The sleeping bag helped, but only after a long while. I lay there listening. Snow creaked as it shifted on branches. Ice cracked faintly along the creek. Far off, something moved through the woods. Slow, heavy, too far away to tell what it was. Sometime during the night, I woke up suddenly. My heart was racing before I knew why. The cold had seeped deep into my body, but that wasn't it. I lay still listening. Then I heard it. Footsteps in snow. Slow, careful, compressed crunches that stopped and started. They were not random. Each step was placed deliberately, as if someone was trying to move quietly but couldn't fully hide the sound. The steps came from the direction of the creek, moving uphill toward my clearing. I froze. I didn't move my head. I didn't reach for my light. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the clearing. Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. I could feel someone standing there, just beyond the trees, looking toward my tent. After a long pause, the steps started again, closer now. Snow compressed softly under weight. Whoever was moved around the clearing slowly, not rushing, not wandering. They stayed just outside the open space, circling, studying. The steps stopped behind my tent. I could hear breathing. Slow, controlled, calm, not labored from cold. Someone stood inches away from the thin fabric separating us. The tent wall shifted slightly as something brushed against it, then returned to place. Not enough to tear, not accidental. A test. My body felt locked in place. My muscles burned from holding still. Time stretched in a way that made it hard to think clearly. Eventually, the footsteps moved away, slowly, back toward the trees. Then silence again. I did not sleep after that. When morning came, the forest looked unchanged, but everything felt wrong. Pale light filtered through the trees. The cold was sharper than before. I stepped out of the tent and immediately checked the snow. Footprints circled the clearing. Boot prints. Large, deep, fresh. They came from the creek, looped around my tent, and led back the same way. I followed them carefully, my breath tight in my chest. The prints led toward the frozen creek and then disappeared into a cluster of trees. I packed most of my gear right then. My plan shifted from staying multiple nights to leaving as soon as possible. Still, part of me hesitated. The snow, the cold, and the long drive made leaving feel risky. I told myself it could have been another camper checking the area, someone passing through, someone who realized I was there and left. I decided to wait until midday before leaving, letting the light strengthen and my hands warm up. That decision would haunt me. As the morning passed, I noticed more things I hadn't seen the day before. Tracks near the creek that weren't animal. A spot where snow had been brushed off a log, like someone had been sitting there for a while. Farther back in the trees, a small pile of firewood stacked neatly, not weathered, not old. Someone had been nearby long before the night. By early afternoon, clouds rolled in, low and heavy. Snow began to fall lightly. Visibility dropped fast. I packed the rest of my gear and started following my own tracks back toward the logging road. Halfway there, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Another set of footprints overlapped mine. Fresh, matching the boot prints from the clearing. They were following my path. I picked up my pace, ignoring the burn in my legs and the sting of cold air in my lungs. The snow fell harder, blurring the tracks behind me. When I reached the road, I saw something that erased any doubt. Another vehicle sat parked farther down the logging road, hidden partially behind trees. Old, dull paint. Snow brushed carefully off the windshield, but not the hood. The engine hood was still warm enough to melt snow. Someone was nearby. I didn't stop to think. I got in my car and started it, tires spinning briefly before catching. As I drove away, I saw movement in my side mirror. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, still and watching, already fading into snowfall. I didn't slow down until I reached pavement and signal hours later. I reported everything. Weeks after, I learned authorities found a man living deep in that forest, moving between old logging roads, watching winter campers because there were fewer witnesses. He had supplies cached across the area and had approached multiple people at night, relying on cold and fear to push them out. I still camp, but never alone in winter and never where tracks can disappear overnight. What stayed with me wasn't the cold or the snow. It was the knowledge that someone had stood inches from me in the dark, patient enough to wait, quiet enough to watch, and real enough to leave footprints that followed me out.